The official story of how Tim Horton died was simple: a late-night car crash. But the crash report and autopsy told a very different story, one involving alcohol, excessive speeds, stimulants, sedatives, and a 4 a.m. drive that should never have happened. For more than 30 years, those details were kept out of public view. Long before the truth finally surfaced, Horton's wrecked car had become a spectacle. Fingers poked through the chain-linked fence, mouths agape, widened eyes scanning the wreckage at the tow yard. They were supposed to be in school, but they had skipped class on a rumor that the broken husk of shattered glass and twisted metal behind the fence was once the car of hockey legend Tim Horton. After the police advised employees at the Simpsons towing yard in St. Catharines to cover the wreckage with a tarp, the crowds finally dispersed. They'd come to gawk. Some people had hoped they could get close enough to snag a macabre souvenir, while others wanted to linger in what precious little remained of the hockey star's presence. The reason for the crowds was because for 20 seasons, Tim Horton patrolled the blue line of the Toronto Maple Leafs, putting together an undeniable Hall of Fame resume, which included 4 Stanley Cups and 6 All-Star teams. His physical strength was legendary. Gordie Howe called him the strongest man in hockey. Every now and then, some young, hotshot rookie would get cheeky with Horton, slash his stick while fighting for a loose puck in the corner, and he would wrap them up in his patented rib-cracking Horton bear hug. The slashing would stop after that. Off the ice, he was mild-mannered and wore thick glasses because of poor eyesight. The combination of strength and poor eyesight prompted Leafs goalie Johnny Bower to nickname him Superman. But after the club fired their longtime coach and GM Punch Imlich, they decided to retool and let the aging star go. Even then, at the age of 40, he was still one of the best rearguards in the game, evidenced by his selection as a second-team All-Star just the year earlier. It was his 3rd consecutive All-Star team appearance. Regardless, the Leafs traded him to the New York Rangers for Dennis Dupire, not exactly a super return. He toiled there for a season and a half. At the end of the 71 season, he retired. Horton was still virile, still the strongest man in hockey, and already a successful businessman. He grew up during the Great Depression, and so, as did many of his generation, had an appreciation for the kinds of comforts and security money brings. This made him a relentless hard worker and a calculated risk-taker, traits that would help him both on the ice and off the ice when it came to business. For a while, he sold cars. One of the men he sold a car to was Ron Joyce, owner of the U Donut shop on Ottawa Street in Hamilton, near where Horton lived. After a brief discussion and a business proposal, the friendly and mild-mannered Horton agreed to sponsor the donut shop with his name and image, and U Donut was rebranded as Tim Horton Donuts. This was in 1964. The shop, specifically with the rebranding, took off. This may have been extremely fortuitous timing, as Horton would have been at the peak of his popularity in the Toronto area. In 1964, Horton set an NHL record for playoff points by a defenseman with 15, while leading the Maple Leafs to their 3rd consecutive Stanley Cup victory. By 71, there were nearly a dozen Tim Horton donut shops around the Hamilton area, and the business was growing rapidly. Retirement wouldn't be a calm, idle rest for Horton. There was too much to do. However, by the end of the 1970-71 NHL campaign, the Pittsburgh Penguins were as flightless as their namesake. They had only made the playoffs once in their first 4 years, and after the shocking death of their young, up-and-coming star center Michel Briere, lacked a strong identity. Penn's head coach Red Kelly was a teammate of Horton's with the Maple Leafs and pleaded with him to come out of retirement to help the faltering Penguins. When Kelly offered him $37,000 to play, which was a third more than he'd made in Toronto, Horton agreed. By the end of the season, though, Horton, who had been known for his strength and resilience, suffered a broken ankle and a separated shoulder, which limited him to 44 games. But Horton's presence with the team gave them a feeling of stability and the added jolt of confidence needed to make the playoffs. Though they were unceremoniously swept by powerhouse Chicago, the Penguins became a playoff fixture through the rest of the decade, solidifying the franchise and legitimizing the team. It would take 20 years, but the Penguins would eventually get their revenge on Chicago. Horton, bruised and battered, would retire once again. However, Imlich, who was then coach and GM of the newly formed Buffalo Sabres, needed a mentor for his young, inexperienced team. Imlich needed a stabilizing force and a father figure for his young team, and he knew exactly where to find one. This time, Horton did not agree. He had enough going on with his business and family life that it was time to walk away from the game. Then, Imlich offered Horton a $100,000 contract, which for the time was an enormous sum for an NHL defenseman. Horton, ever the Depression-era child, couldn't say no to a deal like that, and came out of retirement once again. And once again, Horton helped turn the franchise around. The Sabres were strong in scoring with the famous French Connection line, checking, led by Craig Ramsay and Don Luce, another former Horton teammate with the Rangers, and got good goaltending. But they were a little weak on the back end. At age 43, Horton was no longer the 30-point producer he once was, but he gave them exactly what they needed. His very presence helped mold the careers of young defenders Jim Schoenfeld and Mike Robitaille in particular into reliable rearguards. By year's end, Horton once again found himself a major part of a playoff team. The Sabres put in a scrappy effort against the eventual Cup champs Montreal, taking them to 6 games. But once again, when it was all said and done, Horton retired. And that's where the story should have ended. Horton retiring from pro hockey to focus on family and business. But that's not how the story ended. Imlich, fueled by the taste of success and the promise of greater success to come, wanted one more year from the 23-year NHL veteran. When Horton turned down the offer of another year at $100K, Imlich upped the ante, offering $150,000 for the year. It was an undeniably sweet offer, but he still refused. Then, Horton, still the car dealer at heart, threw out a wild suggestion, one that he didn't think would actually work. He'd sign the deal if Imlich threw in a brand new car, and not just any car, but his dream car, a De Tomaso Pantera, a sporty Italian-built coupe with a Ford V8 engine. To Horton's surprise, Imlich and the Sabres owners agreed. The 1973-74 season didn't go as well as the previous one. After a solid 7-3 start, they began to flounder. The Sabres suffered through winless streaks of 5 or 6 games 3 separate times and found themselves bobbing around 500 by mid-February. On the morning of February 20th, the Sabres were in 5th place in the East Division, and they were going to visit the team they looked up at in the standings, the Toronto Maple Leafs. It was one of those geographical oddity kind of games, a road trip to Toronto in the middle of a 5-game homestand for Buffalo. The Sabres players chartered the team bus for the quick 100-mile trip. If all went well, everyone could be home and in their own beds by just after midnight. But Horton decided not to take the bus, but took the Pantera instead, so he could spend a little extra time with his family and talk business after the game with Joyce. At the morning skate, a puck hit Horton in the jaw, causing him tremendous pain. During the game in Toronto, Horton played through the pain, but was unable to take a regular shift by the 3rd period. His play was inspiring enough for him to be voted 3rd star of the game, despite being held pointless in a 4-2 loss. After the game, Horton took a walk with Imlich while the other players boarded the bus. Horton told him he felt like he'd let the team down. The Sabres had clawed their way back to within 1 goal after stumbling out of the gate and giving away a 3-0 lead. But with Horton out of the regular action, the team faded late and couldn't sustain their comeback bid. His pride hurt. Horton drove to the Tim Horton Donuts office in Oakville to meet with Joyce. Horton sat in the dark, his coat and driver's gloves on, his feet on the table, an ice pack wrapped around his jaw, and a vodka and soda in his hand. At around 3 a.m., he called his wife Lori to tell her he was going home. He also called his brother, who recognized that he'd been drinking, and urged him to sleep it off in the office. Tim didn't heed his brother's advice. If he had, it would have saved his life. According to Joyce, before he left the office, Horton grabbed a handful of painkillers and downed them. However, no painkillers were found in his system as per the autopsy. Traces of Dexamyl, a sedative, was found in his system along with several yellow and purple pills found at the crash site. These yellow and purple pills were Dexamyl and Dexedrine, an amphetamine popular with the jet set at the time. A bottle of vodka was also found among the wreckage. It seemed Horton would drink to excess, then take a stimulant to stay alert, then a sedative to balance the stimulant. It's a cocktail that might have seemed to work in the past but was bound to catch up to him. It's only by the grace of God he didn't hurt anybody else when he inevitably crashed his vehicle. The story that Ron Joyce tells is of a guy with a sore jaw who'd had a couple of drinks and took a few painkillers before hitting the road. However, the autopsy tells the story of a man with twice the legal limit of alcohol in his system, taking uppers to stay alert for a 4 a.m. drive home. One he should never have even attempted. Looking at the evidence, it makes you wonder how many times he'd actually gotten away with it before. Horton sped along Queen Elizabeth Way at 100 to 110 miles an hour. A driver alerted police that a sports car was driving dangerously fast, and an OPP officer was dispatched and awaited Horton's car in St. Catharines. This was at about 4:30 in the morning. The officer couldn't keep up with Horton's excessive speed, and before he'd even realized he was being pursued, he'd lost the officer. The officer told the press that he was doing 100 miles an hour, and even at that speed, lost sight of Horton's vehicle. Moments later, that officer came upon the crash scene. Horton was the first NHL player to die from drunk driving, but unfortunately he wouldn't be the last, not nearly. Because they found his number in Horton's possession, Sabres head coach Joe Crozier was the first to find out about his death. It was a terrible shock to everyone that knew him. Amazingly, the Sabres actually played a game that night. Both the Sabres and their opponents, the Atlanta Flames, wore black armbands in honor of Horton. The details of Horton's crash report and autopsy were not released to the public. It wasn't until 2005 that a journalist with the Ottawa Citizen got a hold of the records and revealed the shocking details of Horton's intoxication. The Sabres and Flames skated numbly to a 4-4 tie that night. Warning: all these stories are true, even the ones that contradict each other. Neil was a fugitive, a criminal. Just a few hours earlier, he'd been a professional hockey coach. His hands gripped the wheel of the rental car tightly. He checked the rear-view mirror every couple of seconds, looking for red and blue flashing lights. Checking his speed not to draw attention to himself. A sea of red brake lights swam in front of him as he entered the city of Atlanta. He was coming from Birmingham, where a couple hours earlier he'd been coaching the New England Whalers. Things were getting a little too tame on the ice. A hockey game was breaking out. The Alabama hockey fans started shouting, "Bring on the Goons!" There was no team better suited to oblige the tastes of the Birmingham crowd than the Minnesota Fighting Saints. Their coach was Harry Neal. But they were gone, and now Neal found himself behind the Whalers bench. Not too many goons there, not like the Fighting Saints. Anyway, it was Thanksgiving in Birmingham, and the fans had been verbally abusing the Whalers and their coach all night. When they started throwing things, it crossed the line. Neal grabbed a stick off the rack and started swinging it at his abusers. He got in a good whack or two, but accidentally hit a woman.
The police wanted to have a little chat with Neil after the incident. Next thing you know, he's rushing out the locker room and hailing a taxi to the rental car place, and, well, let's just say the woman eventually settled out of court. It was hard for someone who had survived the Fighting Saints to understand what was the big deal. Things got out of hand all the time back in St. Paul. Shaky was the best player for the Fighting Saints. On the ice, puck on his stick, he was a poem told in chopping strides. End-to-end rushes, dancing around defenders, 100 miles an hour. Then, boom, clapper from the face-off circle, glove side and in. The mesh ripples. 3,000 people lose their minds. Shaky was going to be a big star. Back in Toronto, they'd groomed him to be the replacement for Frank Mahovlich, who didn't really like the spotlight. It didn't quite work out that way, but don't tell Shaky that. Loose puck through the neutral zone, open ice, nobody between Shaky and the goalie. He's got a head of steam, legs chopping, dancing again. This is what he lives for. He touches the puck. The whistle blows. Shaky looks over his shoulder. His teammate, Gord Gallant, is drifting to the penalty box. Shaky slaps his stick on the ice, button hooks towards the box, starts yelling. The whole building can hear him, every word, cussing out his own teammate. When the penalty's over, Gallant skates back to the bench and beats hell out of Shaky in front of everyone. The ref wants to call a penalty on the Fighting Saints for the fight. Neil said, "There's no rule against two teammates fighting." The ref thinks about it for a minute and says, "Well, you got a point there." Shaky got treated differently. Everyone knew it. It drove some guys nuts. Others just shrugged. That was the deal. He'd be all in some game days, just a rumor with a shadow on others. If you weren't one of the first guys at the bank to cash your check, forget it. Veterans showed up late for practices on payday. Shaky wouldn't even park with the other players. Every now and then, Neil would pick him up personally. No woodshed speeches, no paperwork, just a drive and a conversation. Most nights it didn't change much, but every once in a while it worked. And on those nights, Shaky could do it all. Of course, some nights he did too much. One night, they said, he fought his own teammate on the ice. Like this sort of thing happened all the time. One other night, rumor has it, things weren't going his way, so he up and skates off the ice in the middle of the period, right past the locker room, and just kept going. They found him after the game at the bar, still in his skates and uniform. Things got out of hand sometimes in St. Paul. But that's not how it happened. It went like this. It actually happened in South Chicago. The whistle blew, and Neil's reaction was immediate. Protest, hot under the collar. 1 foot up on the top of the boards, leaning in and really giving it to the refs. Then the fans got on him. The banging on the glass, the laughter, the smart comments. Banging becomes pushing. Pushing gets too close for comfort. So Neil pushes back. Now more fans pile in, pushing against the glass. Now a couple Saints players are pushing back with Neil. Before you know it, it's a seesaw battle. Someone grabs a stick and starts swatting it over the top of the glass. Then another stick. And another. In one regular old game in San Diego, this guy was chirping Shaky all night. Now you've got to remember, in San Diego, they've got chicken wire instead of plexiglass along the end boards. There's a scrum in the corner and the guy gets a little too close. He's got his face pressed right up against the chicken wire, talking smack. Shaky lets him have it. Bunk, with the butt end of the stick. The guy got back up with a red rectangle stamped across his forehead. The case got dismissed. The judge agreed that guy was crazy. Some of the veteran players knew to keep the car running on payday. The boss would sign the check, hand it over with a solemn look. Guys had about 20 minutes tops to get to the bank, and if there was a lineup when you got there, look out. On road trips, some of the older guys, the staff and veterans, would peel into a dark corner and chip in for lunch to feed the guys who hadn't got paid yet. They'd be out there promoting scrimmages, radio spots, meet and greets. Tickets sold well, but never as many as they needed. Then the bank would call. So you dig in and shake a few more hands before the next game. Just keep kicking that can down the road. 20 minutes west, the North Stars were at the peak of their popularity. Shaky could light them up. Cheech could hang with their snipers. Other than that, the Fighting Saints had what the North Stars didn't, a little muscle in the lineup. Every year, Glenn Sonmore would challenge the North Stars to an all-Twin Cities exhibition match. And every year, the North Stars would glance down and politely decline. They were always a little more Edina, while the Fighting Saints were always a little more East St. Paul. What actually happened was the coach was walking to the players' bench with Goldie. There was a police barricade holding back the crowd. Those fans in Houston were rowdy. One guy kind of breaks the cordon and gets close enough for Goldie to get a mid on him. Whack! The guy's out cold. The whole place loses it. The mob pushes in, the cops are pushing back. Coach and Goldie are ducking, dodging, and swinging wildly as they get surrounded. Finally, the cops broke everything up and escorted them to the Saints bench. Goldie smirked when he looked over his shoulder and saw the police trying to revive the guy so they could arrest him. Or was it that time in Cleveland where a fan dumped beer on Neil? They always did that in Cleveland. Most guys would just smart off and tell the fans to pick a better brand, but not Neil. He charged into the stands and went right after the guy. Some of the players went in there with him too. But that one fan never charged Bill Butters for biting him on the hand. And the sticks? Pye McKenzie's skating by the Saints bench. He looks right at Harry Neal and makes a rude comment. Just spits it out with venom. Without hesitating, Neal calmly turned around, grabbed a stick, and started swinging it in Pye's face. McKenzie didn't back down either. He went right over to Neal and they started fighting. Then the benches cleared. 8,000 people went crazy. There were a few times when things got out of hand in St. Paul. He let the phone ring. Almost definitely going to be someone who wanted money anyway. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. He decided then and there he was going to the airport. The flight was booked for the next game. There was somebody, a truck driver apparently, who was going to buy the team. He had at least agreed to support everybody through the weekend. It was a sorry turnout at the airport. Just a handful of players. Shaky and Cheech were there, and Harry Neal. They were expecting more. Not enough to make a team and carry on. Guess the rest just gave up on believing. Or maybe they just ran out of money. Those who did show up voted right there on the spot to fold the team. That way, everybody could sign somewhere else and pick up a couple paychecks before the season ended. Rest of the guys found out in the newspapers the next day, if they weren't out of town by then already.
Before we move on to our next story, if you enjoy hockey-related storytelling, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for regular updates. Also, comment a story you'd like me to cover. Now, back to the video.
When things were going good, Maple Leaf Gardens was like the church of hockey. The crowd was silent, reverent, observant. If you could find tickets, you'd dress your family in their Sunday best and expect a good effort. Frank Mahovlich was the kind of player who liked to get out on the ice and get a feel for how things were going. He would tinker. He would try things. The Maple Leafs crowd paid to see a finished product, not a work in progress. When things weren't going, they'd get on a player. He noticed. Before long, even when things were going good, they'd get on him. When Mahovlich tinkered, the crowd saw hesitation. When he was tired at the end of a shift, they saw laziness. He'd score one goal, they'd question the two that didn't go in. He was quiet in the locker room. The other guys didn't get a chance to know him. He'd answer reporters' questions through gritted teeth. Sometimes, He just wanted to be by himself for a while. On 2 separate occasions, he took a few weeks off during the season to see a psychiatrist. The crowd noticed. Punch Imlich had tried everything. He tried coddling the guy, he tried talking to him quietly, he tried yelling at him. A kick in the pants just made him sit down. Finally, he traded him to Detroit. In Detroit, Gordy was the guy, no question. Mahovlich didn't have to live up to everybody else's expectations. In Toronto, they compared him to Hull and Beliveau and Gordy. Then they'd look at the stat sheet and ask what happened. They missed the big picture. The Big M had finished his time in Toronto 11th on the all-time goals list, wearing 4 Stanley Cup rings. When the conquistadors landed in America, their horses had been cooped up on the ships for months. When they made landfall, the horses ran around like crazy, leaping and cavorting. Guys who knew him in Toronto hardly recognized Mahovlich in Detroit. There's Frank. He's laughing and smiling. He's joking around. He's talking philosophically. Who was this guy? Where'd he been all those years? Detroit was a great place to play, but the Red Wings were a team on the downswing. He followed his brother to Montreal in 1971. There, he was given respect and a defined role. Sam Pollock was criticized by the Canadian media at the time for trading 3 good young players for a 33-year-old. The results spoke for themselves. The big Mahovlich boys killed penalties together. Frank set a playoff scoring record that year and a surprise Stanley Cup victory. Nobody in Montreal complained when Mickey Redmond hit 50 goals back-to-back times in Detroit. Frank, now fully unlocked, had a career year in 1972 with 96 points. The Summit Series happened. Another cup followed. He became just the 5th man to 500 NHL goals. When his contract was up, Pollock offered $250,000 per year to extend. There was another expansion draft that summer. Mahovlich advised Pollock to expose him. Mahovlich was planning on going back to Toronto. John Bassett had a way of making everything exciting. Bassett had been a multi-sport star, a reporter, and now owned the Toronto Toros of the WHA. He was also owner of the Memphis Southmen of the short-lived WFL. When Elvis Presley met him, he asked for Bassett's autograph. Mahovlich provided an autograph for Bassett when he signed with the WHA Toros. The press was confused. Why return to the scene of years of torment? Mahovlich said it was about security for his family, even though Pollock had offered more money. Now with the other big league Toronto team, he was back in Maple Leaf Gardens. Harold Ballard made the Toros play in the locker room reserved for visitors to the junior Marlies. He took the padding off the benches in the locker room for WHA games. But nobody got in his case with the Toros. Not the fans, not the media. He produced, he stayed quiet. Other guys stepped into the spotlight. They had Nedomansky, the Czech Gordie Howe, Henderson, Canada's hero. He gave everybody a Bible at the Christmas party. And then there was Gilles Gratton. That guy was a one-man circus. And then there was the underage kid that led the team in scoring. There was enough going on with the club that Mahovlich didn't have to be the center of attention. His game aged gracefully. Eventually, the team moved to the Deep South, but kept their logo and were now the Birmingham Bulls. Mahovlich went from the center of the hockey universe to virtual invisibility in Alabama. The organist would play Dixie between whistles. He played well. Eventually, in order to draw crowds, the Bulls packed the roster full of goons. Frank Beaton and the Hampson brothers weren't exactly Gordy and Fats, but he still managed 38 points. 38 points with 2 goons is pretty good for a 40-year-old, even in a second-rate league. One day, the contract ran out. He quietly packed his bags and just didn't return. All this time, they'd never forgotten him in the show. Even then, in the fall of 1978, he was still getting offers for Montreal and Pittsburgh. He said no. His back was sore. He had a travel agency business to get back home anyway. A year later, it was good to feel leg muscles burning again. The crack of sticks, the spray of the ice. He had followed his brother once more, this time back to Detroit, this time on a tryout. He was 41 years old. As a young man, he figured he'd play until age 34 or so. That sounded like a good, long career at the time. Of course, there was no WHA back then, just like there wasn't one in September 1979. He played out the preseason, but never earned the spotlight again. When the exhibition schedule was completed, he told Wings coach Bobby Crom he didn't think he could hack it anymore, and walked away again. Crom was relieved that he didn't have to tell him. He patted Mahovlich on the shoulder and told him he was a hell of a player.
For years, one of the strangest things in hockey happened every game night in Toronto. The Maple Leafs had a superstar, a Calder Trophy winner, a 48-goal scorer, a 4-time Stanley Cup champion, and the fans hated him. They booed him when he scored. They booed him when he touched the puck. Sometimes, they booed him just for stepping onto the ice. It was spring 1963. The Maple Leafs had won their second consecutive Stanley Cup. 150,000 people had turned out to watch the victory parade and celebration. The entire Maple Leafs team stood atop the steps of Toronto's old City Hall. One by one, the names of the players were announced to raucous cheers. Armstrong, Bauer, Horton. Cheers and applause. Kelly, Keon. Cheers and applause. Mahovlich. A cascade of boos rained down at the mention of the club's resident scoring star. Roll call continued. Eddie Shack, Alan Stanley. Cheers and applause. All the good teams had their own superstars. Howe, Hull, Rocket Richard. Even the Rangers had Andy Bathgate. The Maple Leafs had the Big M. He had beaten out Bobby Hull for the Calder Trophy. He outscored Gordie Howe's pace after 3 years. By year 4, he was on track to shatter Rocket Richard's single-season record. He had 36 goals after 40 games, then 40 after 50, then 45 after 60. With a little push, he could still make it. On a breakaway late in the season against Chicago, Mahovlich let loose with a shot from 10 feet out. Boom! The puck bounced off the end boards. He finished with 48, a new Leafs record. It didn't matter. Boom Boom Geoffrion passed him for the league lead during the last month of the season and hit 50. He'd even missed 6 games. When it was over, Leafs fans didn't remember the accomplishment. They remembered what they considered to be a failure. It didn't help that in baseball that same season, Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's home run record. After that, the autograph seekers shied away and dried up. To compound matters, his follow-up seasons of 33, 36, and 26 goals were considered flops. It didn't matter that those totals were the second, third, and sixth best in the league in those years. Leafs fans were impatient for their 50-goal season. If he'd skated around like a madman, he would have been accepted. He would have been loved, but his effortless skating style and relatively lower stamina gave fans the impression that he was lazy. Sometimes he took a moment to consider his options with the puck, which looked like a lack of intensity. He got saddled with the reputation of someone who could be great when he felt like it, which wasn't often enough. He'd been held scoreless in Toronto's playoff run in 1963. Never mind that he was playing on a wrenched knee, then contracted influenza, and only missed 1 game. If you were Frank Mahovlich, the booing had to bother you. Mahovlich played through it. The real problem was Punch Imlich. Punch was not a player's coach. He never gave Mahovlich his public backing. On the contrary, Imlich's public comments acted as a billows to the boos. Imlich purposefully mispronounced his name and questioned Mahovlich's work ethic. Imlich once told the media, "Hockey is a streetcar named Desire. In too many days, Mahovlich doesn't catch the train." Some of the fans ate this stuff up, figuring if it came from the coach who watched him every day in practice, it had to be true. Soon, Mahovlich was on a treadmill of internal criticism and public rejection. Imlich's abuse was relentless. Later, the coach claimed he did it to motivate Mahovlich, but also admitted it didn't work. Still, he kept at it. And through it all, Mahovlich never lost his temper, never said something he regretted later. He internalized it. After a while, his Leafs teammates assumed he was just a quiet guy. At the beginning of the 1964-65 season, the Leafs were reigning three-time Stanley Cup champs. By mid-November, they'd lost only 3 of 12 games, and Mahovlich had 12 points. The boos continued. By November 12, 1964, Mahovlich had finally had enough of it. He checked himself into the hospital with exhaustion. Fans and media were nonplussed. It was reported that Mahovlich had been admitted to Toronto General Hospital on an emergency basis and was allowed no visitors. No details were given. In the vacuum, there was much speculation. Some suggested he was in for cancer treatment. After a week or two, he resumed practicing away from the Leafs. His wife would drive him to practice with a local varsity team. Those who watched him there said he looked stronger and faster than ever. After practice, Mahovlich held an impromptu press conference in the skating rink parking lot. He told the press that he felt fine. Moments later, his wife drove him back to the hospital. Speculation increased. When asked for details, Mahovlich would refer back to the doctors. When questioned, the doctors would volley back to Mahovlich. When reporters pressed the team, Imlich declined comment, citing medical advice. When they pressed the hospital, officials said only that no public statement would be made. At the time, it was considered essential that the nature of Mahovlich's condition remain undisclosed. At the beginning of December, Mahovlich was released from hospital. He resumed practicing with the Leafs. On December 9th came the big test, his first game back. When the public address announcer called his name before puck drop, the Maple Leafs faithful gave Mahovlich a loud and long standing ovation. Despite missing those 11 games, Mahovlich ended up leading the team in scoring. It didn't happen all at once, but eventually, little by little, the boos started up again. In a home game on November 1st, 1967, Mahovlich was named second star with 3 points in a 5-0 drubbing of the Montreal Canadiens. When he skated out to center ice to take a bow, he did it to a soundtrack of boos. The next morning, the team boarded a train for Detroit. Something had been gnawing at Mahovlich, and he could no longer ignore it. He got up out of his seat, told teammates that he wouldn't be joining them, then got off the train. He went straight back to the hospital. This time, they didn't try to hide what was going on. Headlines blared exhaustion, tension, and depression in all caps. His condition was considered serious. Once again, he was allowed no visitors and no phone calls. Some worried he'd never play again. Others saw it as flakiness. The Leafs team doctor asked reporters to avoid speculation altogether, saying the reasons being discussed publicly were nowhere close to the truth. Imlich was done with him this time. It seemed that everybody in Toronto saw a big, strong guy and wanted him to be aggressive. But Mahovlich was shy and introverted. Even still, he stood just outside the top 10 in all-time goal scorers. It was never enough. When he returned to the lineup on December 2nd, there was no ovation this time, just a cold reception that eventually deteriorated into more boos and indifference. In March of 1968, he was traded to Detroit. There he seemed to come out of his shell, becoming a vocal locker room presence and increasing his scoring. For more on this period of Mahovlich's career, see our previous video. Mahovlich later referred to the 4 years between hospitalizations as the worst period of his life. Imlich had been good to him until after the 48-goal season. Afterwards, he became hypercritical. He would say and do little petty things to punish Mahovlich over the slightest infraction. The more Imlich pushed, the more Mahovlich withdrew. Mahovlich said Imlich's treatment of him was ridiculous, and that those years were a laborious disaster. And so it begs the question, why didn't they just trade him earlier? In today's NHL, Mahovlich would have been traded 10 times over during 4 seasons. It should be noted, however, that not once did Mahovlich request a trade. When he did get traded, he was shocked. Despite the criticism, Mahovlich still performed at an elite level. Other teams had tried to acquire him, but ownership blocked any deals involving their superstar. Imlich's continuous application of pressure suggests he assumed it would work eventually. The evidence shows that Imlich never gave up on him, until he did. It was later suggested that the worst thing to ever happen to Mahovlich was getting off to a hot scoring start in 1960-61. Perception changed, and so did expectations. Mahovlich couldn't live up to them. Still, one can't help but think that if everybody didn't demand so much from Mahovlich, they might have gotten even more out of him. The first professional hockey player to reach 2,000 career points wasn't Wayne Gretzky. It wasn't Gordie Howe. It was Guyle Fielder, and he did it on the West Coast, outside the NHL spotlight, piling up points in the Western Hockey League long before the league expanded enough to notice players like him. To those who took notice, and they were few in the hockey world, it was a beguiling mystery. How come one of the greatest passers and most creative playmakers in the game wasn't playing in the NHL? There are several contributing factors to this, and many of them were in Fielder's control. For the record, Fielder's NHL record comprises 15 career games with 4 different teams over the course of 8 seasons. In those games, he didn't register a point. One common misconception about the career of Guyle Fielder is that he somehow missed his chance at the big time, that the NHL had somehow overlooked or rejected him. This isn't true. Fielder was already playing senior hockey by age 13. At age 15, he earned his family a $100 bonus for signing a contract with the Chicago Blackhawks. In his last 2 years of juniors, he scored 205 points in 76 games. At age 20, he played 3 games late in the year with the struggling Blackhawks and scored no points. The Blackhawks were the worst team in the league that year by a large margin. Rookie head coach Ebby Goodfellow sent Fielder out only for a few shifts. In his first NHL game, Fielder had to watch from the bench while his team lost 7-0 to the Red Wings. This was a formative experience. Another common misconception is that Fielder's size held him out of the NHL. At 5'9", 165 pounds, one might assume he was too small. But this made him the same size as Dave Keon and Stan Mikita. For the 1951-52 season, the Hawks sent Fielder to the New Westminster Royals of the Pacific Coast League, soon to be renamed Western Hockey League. He scored 76 points in just 57 games and won Rookie of the Year. That summer, he was acquired by Detroit, who sent him to the Edmonton Flyers of the Western League under coach Bud Poile. Fielder and Poile didn't see eye to eye. One night, early in his Edmonton tenure, some of Fielder's buddies from his hometown of Nipawin, Saskatchewan visited his hotel room with a case of beer. Fielder's room was right next to Poile's. Poile sent Fielder to the St. Louis Flyers of the American League. There, he scored 83 points in 62 games to capture that league's Rookie of the Year title. He finished 3 points back of Cleveland's Eddie Olson for the league lead. If he'd have started the season in St. Louis, he might have hit it. St. Louis finished near the bottom of the standings, and when the regular season was over, he was sent to play with the Red Wings for their playoff series against Boston. He played 4 games and scored no points. Again, he got into only a couple of shifts per game. In the first game, he had to watch from the bench while the Red Wings won 7-0. The Wings eventually lost the series in a shocking upset. Eventually, he settled in Seattle of the Western League. In the 1957 season, he set a professional hockey record by scoring 122 points. The Red Wings took notice, and Fielder once again found himself suiting up for the team. This time, Fielder thought he'd finally made it. He made arrangements for his wife Beverly to come over and stay with him in Detroit. Coach Jimmy Skinner put him on a line with Gordie Howe. Most unproven players would have given anything to play on a line with Howe, but for Fielder, it was a bad fit. Both men liked to control the puck. Both were play drivers, and therefore didn't complement each other. Instead of having two play drivers on two different lines, Skinner tried putting them together to predictably fruitless results. Fielder was benched for not producing. He was angry. On a Friday, Fielder went into Red Wings manager Jack Adams' office and told him he wasn't going to sit on the bench. If Detroit wasn't going to play him, could they at least just trade him back to Seattle? That Sunday, he met Beverly at the airport and told her they were going back home. They went back to his motel to watch the Red Wings game on TV, then packed their belongings and drove back across the country to their home in New Westminster. Beverly didn't mind, and the couple treated it as a road trip vacation. When he got back to Seattle, he scored 111 points in just 62 games. Fielder liked to have 2 beers immediately after a game, to replace fluid. Beer's good for that, he'd say. Before a game, when the bus would arrive in a new town, Fielder would find a local pool hall, hustle $50 in pocket money, then hurry back over to the rink. After his 2 post-game beers, he'd go right back out to the pool hall for another 50. When he wasn't on the road, he was an apprentice electrician. Fielder was born in 1930. The Depression made tireless workers of an entire generation. Fielder was no exception. In 1958, the Maple Leafs were rebuilding. It had been ages since their last Stanley Cup back in '51. Too long for the proud Maple Leafs. Punch Imlich picked up Fielder in the off-season draft. Imlich wanted to send Fielder to Rochester for seasoning. Fielder refused to report. Imlich actually flew out to New Westminster to meet with Fielder and try to persuade him to come over. Fielder wouldn't budge. He didn't want to leave his job as an apprentice electrician. He'd prefer to keep his home life stable rather than try to move his family over to the East Coast again for little pay. Imlich flew back to Toronto, shaking his head. Besides, for Fielder, the game was more like an art project than the means to an end. The NHL game represented the brutality, lowest common denominator of the sport. And why uproot his family to take a bit part when he was the leading man where he was? Imlich suspended Fielder. That year he scored 119 points for the Seattle Totems. The suspension held. He was never invited to another NHL tryout. Fielder never looked back. He won 3 President's Cups with the Totems as league champions, 9 WHL leading scorer awards between 1954 and 1967, 6 George Leader Cups as WHL MVP, 3 Fred J. Hume Cups as gentlemanly player. Arguably, his most impressive accomplishment was bagging 1,430 apples over 1,425 games. If he'd finished with that many points, we'd still be talking about him. Fielder's game wasn't built on blazing speed or bludgeoning toughness. It was about awareness, anticipation, and precision. It was no-look passes and puck control for long stretches. He could score goals at will, but he'd prefer to make others do it. He took a real satisfaction in being the guy who made the play happen, the first domino. Fielder felt the future of the game would be built on passing, like the way the Soviets played, not on brutality, which was more aligned to the NHL model. The NHL treated its players like cattle. Team owners were Roman emperors. The players were nothing more than gladiators. In the Western League, star players were treated with dignity and respect and were reasonably well paid. The move over to the NHL would require a significant pay cut. In the NHL, Fielder had been labeled with a bad boy reputation for being a free spirit who liked his booze too much, that he partied a little too hard. The reality was that Fielder never went beyond those 2 post-game beers, and none of his Western League coaches ever had a negative thing to say about him. But in an environment that attempted to break any and all comers, self-respect was seen as a red flag. When he broke Gordie Howe's career record for most points in pro hockey, his then-current team, the Portland Buckaroos, gathered up the puck and framed it in a plaque. That's the one trophy he kept. The rest of them were taking up too much room, so he donated them to a local hockey association. When Fielder finally retired in 1973, the Western League retired with him. Not immediately, but in essence. The league lasted only one more year. It was supposed to have merged with the NHL in a deal that fell through. By now, there's teams in Los Angeles, Vancouver, Edmonton, Denver, Seattle, and Salt Lake City. We're still waiting on teams in Portland and San Diego, but that's another story. The death of the WHL ensured that Fielder's career records will never be touched, but expansion itself guarantees it won't happen in any other minor league. It simply could not happen again that a player of Fielder's caliber would spend a 23-year career entirely outside the NHL. There's too much money today, and too many jobs available for it to ever happen again. Former defenseman and coach Hal Laycoe suggested Fielder was born 20 years too early. By the time the NHL finally expanded and began to dismantle the Western League, Fielder was 36 years old with a whole established life outside of hockey. It's reasonable to assume that had the NHL expanded earlier, specifically to the West Coast, Fielder might have committed to landing a major league job. But there was one overriding factor. He wasn't going to ride the bench. He was going to play, and he was going to play his way. After the 1967 expansion draft, the Oakland Seals were expected to be the cream of the crop of the 6 new clubs. But the Seals never found their footing. Playing all year to an empty building, there was daily chatter about the team moving to Vancouver, Canada, by as early as the start of their second season. The Bay Area had been granted an expansion team with the idea that the Seals would play in San Francisco and serve as a tentpole franchise. The NHL had only secured a television deal with NBC on the basis of having 2 West Coast clubs, one of them in glamorous San Francisco, not seedy Oakland. But the Seals struggled to find a suitable facility in San Francisco, and owner Barry Van Gerbig was in over his head. In an 11th-hour, desperate move, he placed the team in Oakland. For a variety of reasons, it was a fatal decision. The on-ice results followed suit. General manager Rudy Pellew resigned before the start of the season. The Seals became the doormats of the NHL. Fans in Oakland weren't interested, and the players hated their coach and GM, Bert Olmsted. Well, everybody except one. Ted Hampson wasn't happy when he found out he'd been traded to Oakland. In fact, he was devastated. He came over from Detroit in a mid-season deal with young defender Bert Marshall and winger John Brenneman for 32-year-old defenseman Kent Douglas. Hampson had been the Red Wings' second-line center, scoring an efficient 27 points in 37 games. The journeyman had been on the AHL-NHL shuttle for much of the decade, playing for multiple organizations. He finally started to stick around in the big league with Detroit during the 1967 season, at age 30. The Red Wings were having a miserable year, but it was nothing compared to what was unfolding in Oakland. The last-place Seals drew crowds of less than 3,000, and even those numbers were dwindling. To make matters worse, Coach Olmsted had the reputation of a demanding taskmaster. For his part, Hampson was known as a fast-skating playmaker and a hard worker. To the bewilderment of his teammates, Olmsted took a shine to Hampson. Hampson continued to be productive, scoring 27 points in 34 games with his new team, and was named an alternate captain. But the results in the standings and the box office showed no improvement. Olmsted resigned before the end of the campaign. Van Gerbig brought in new general manager Frank Selke Jr. and apologized to fans for their performance. He promised dedication and commitment to the community for the upcoming season. A little over a decade earlier, Hampson had led the Flin Flon Bombers to a Memorial Cup title. His NHL rights were held by the Rangers organization. He was placed on waivers before the season for assignment to Providence, but the Maple Leafs chairman of the hockey committee remembered that Hampson had helped the Bombers defeat Sam Pollock's Ottawa Junior Canadiens in the Memorial Cup and claimed him. Yes, things were that petty in the original Six era. His first week with the Leafs was a major success. He scored 2 goals and 4 points in his first 4 games. Some scribes compared his smooth skating and puck-moving ability to that of Leafs Hall of Famer Joe Primo. But by the end of the season, Hampson had learned firsthand that coach Punch Imlich didn't like to play rookies, and he found himself in a checking role with the Rochester Americans. That summer, he was reclaimed by the Rangers and spent the next 3 years as a utility forward, mostly in New York. In the summer of 1963, he was picked up by Detroit and dispatched to their farm club in Pittsburgh, where he spent the next 3 seasons. Finally, he broke through with Detroit, scoring 48 points with the big club in 1967. They even protected him in the expansion draft, but Detroit general manager Sid Abel was desperate to upgrade his defense corps, and, as he put it, you have to give up something good. After the 1968 season, Seals captain Bob Bond requested a trade. The organizational instability and lack of fan interest bothered him, so Selke traded him to Detroit with Ron Harris for a package that included left-winger Gary Jarrett. Jarrett provided the Seals with speed and an upgrade on offense. Before the season started, Hampson was tapped as the next team captain. He would be teamed with Jarrett and one-time Rocket Richard heir apparent Bill Hick on the club's top line. The trio became known as the Assembly Line. Early in the season, Van Gerbig sold a controlling share of the club to Seymour Knox. Knox intended to move the team to Buffalo, but the move wasn't approved by the league. Neither the sale nor the relocation attempt was known to NHL President Clarence Campbell or Seals President Bill Torrey until after the fact. Selke later claimed the league wanted to preserve the Buffalo territory so it could collect a $6 million expansion fee. Meanwhile, Van Gerbig still owed the NHL the remainder of the Seals' original expansion fee. On the ice, the Seals never found consistency, but neither did the rest of the All-Expansion West Division. Despite a poor record, the Seals remained in a playoff position for most of the season. They needed everybody's help to win, and Hampson led by example. Hustlin' Ted Hampson set the tone night after night, pacing the club in scoring and in effort. He skated in all situations, including on the penalty kill, prompting Selke to declare Hampson the best all-around center in the West Division. There were few who disagreed. The league also blocked a proposed move across the bay to San Francisco. The Seals played select home games at the Cow Palace, but sometimes drew fewer than 2,000 fans there. The WHL Seals routinely sold out the same venue. With no hope of bringing the NHL club there full-time, there was little incentive for fans to invest in the team. Before the Knox deal was quashed, there had been other proposed sales involving Labatt Breweries and a group called Puck Inc. Each time Van Gerbig attempted to sell the team, the league stepped in and rejected the deal. On the ice, the trouble was getting everyone going at once. When the goaltenders stood on their heads, the assembly line went cold. When the big line cranked out offense, the goaltending fell flat. Pep talks and team-building activities only went so far. In what may have been the club's brightest early moment, the Seals beat the Montreal Canadiens 5-4 in front of 8,100 home fans, but then struggled against weaker teams like Detroit. They would beat Boston 3-1 one night, then lose 8-5 to the Kings the next. Meanwhile, Hampson recorded 2 or more points on 19 separate occasions, including each of the final 5 games as the club geared up for the playoffs. Hampson finished with 75 on the year. Together, the assembly line racked up 181 points. The Seals finished just 7 games under 500, good enough for second place in the division, and the best season in franchise history. Their first-round opponent would be the Kings. The Seals lost every game against the Kings until the final 2 games of the regular season. The series opened in Oakland. The Seals were required to guarantee the league $30,000 in ticket revenue over the first 2 games for the player pool. To meet that demand, and pay rent, they would need to sell roughly 8,500 tickets per game. Even at home, the Kings were almost as poor a draw, and even the Canadians hadn't sold that many tickets in Oakland. In April of 1969, the Oakland Arena had a seating capacity of 13,502. By puck drop for Game 1, roughly 10,000 tickets remained unsold. The Seals would be playing at a loss, even in the playoffs. That meant the deeper they went, the more money they would lose. Unless, Torrey and Selke reasoned, the team went on an unbelievable tear and captured the imagination of the city. The Seals lost Game 1 in overtime. Hampson was held up the score sheet. Over the next 3 games, he went on a tear of his own, extending another multi-point streak. By the time the series returned to Oakland, it was tied at 2 games apiece. Hampson collected $1,000 in bonuses for winning both the club MVP and leading scorer awards. The official attendance figures for Games 1 and 2, 5,449 and 5,232. For comparison, the Montreal-New York series that year drew 32,804 fans over its first 2 games. Those who did turn out in Oakland littered the ice with debris and empty paper cups. Play was stopped several times to clear the surface. Referee Glenn Skov had beer dumped on him between periods. For Game 5, Oakland fans showed signs of life, purchasing 7,757 tickets, a marked improvement. It suggested the market would support a winner. When the final horn sounded, the Seals had won 4-1 and taken a 3-2 series lead. The Kings took Game 6 at home. Hampson was held scoreless over the final 2 games and finished a combined -2. The team was bipolar, looking like a world-class club one night and disinterested the next. Game 7 returned to Oakland Arena. A crowd of 9,384 finally cleared the league's sales threshold. But the Seals couldn't clear the Kings. Nor could Oakland's defense clear the zone, as the heavier Kings' forecheck hemmed them in. The Seals looked inexperienced, hesitant to make decisions. The game ended in a 5-3 Kings victory. Just as it started to look like the Seals might finally make money instead of losing it. That summer, Hampson learned he had won the Masterton trophy while away on a trip. The league held an awards banquet in those days, and Hampson's absence and ignorance felt quietly appropriate for the city he played in. It remains the only NHL award ever won by a Seal. The following season, the Seals coach put the lines in a blender and had Hampson playing alongside more inexperienced wingers. He found himself concentrating on babysitting, and his numbers reflected it. Just 2 assists in his first 9 games. He eventually found his footing, finishing the season with 52 points. But the club dropped 11 points in the standings, slipping to 4th place. They were swept out of the first round by the Penguins. It would be the franchise's final playoff appearance. Later that year, the club was sold to Charles O. Finley. Finley rebranded the team as the California Golden Seals and had the players wear white skates. Hampson was traded to the North Stars late in the 1971 season. The Seals were in last place, with no hope of climbing out and little left to play for. Still, Hampson was stunned. "I'm not unhappy with where I'm going," he said, "but I'm sad about leaving here. This place gets to you, and this was my team."
On February 21, 1985, St. Louis Blues general manager Ron Caron shipped starting goaltender Mike Liut and a player to be named later to the Hartford Whalers for goaltender Greg Millen and Whalers captain Mark Johnson. At the time, the Blues were in first place in the Norris Division and had recently enjoyed a 12-3-4 run. As a hockey trade, the timing didn't make a lot of sense. Liut had been a heart and soul guy in St. Louis, part of a strong core which included Bernie Federko, Joey Mullen, Rob Ramage, and Captain Brian Sutter. Liut had been an award-winning goaltender with the Blues and was considered elite at his position. So why did the Blues trade away their franchise goaltender? The 1970s were unkind to the Blues. Since Glenn Hall's retirement in 1971, stability in net had been elusive, and as the decade wore on, fan enthusiasm followed suit. Consequently, attendance fell from league best in the early 70s to near the bottom by the end of the decade. Mike Liut had been drafted by the Blues in 1976 but didn't sign with them. After finishing his amateur career at Bowling Green University, Liut signed with the New England Whalers of the WHA and was then traded to the Cincinnati Stingers. There, he was able to quietly work his way up the ranks of the Stingers from a backup with a post-4 goals against average to a chain-starting, sub-350 stabilizer. When the WHA merged into the NHL, it did not take the Stingers with it. The club folded, and Liut's NHL rights reverted to the team that had originally drafted him. The Blues brought him in to be the backup to long-suffering incumbent Ed Staniowski. Before the halfway mark of the 1979-80 season, Liut had established himself as the better goalie and once again took the bulk of the starts to finish the year. His play was crucial to the Blues' 32-point improvement in the standings. Before long, his large frame, thoughtful nature, and college pedigree had hockey people comparing him to Ken Dryden. In 1980-81, he won the Lester B. Pearson Award for Best Player in the League as voted by the players. This time, the Blues improved by 27 points and finished as the second best team in the league. The Blues' defense was weak. The best defenseman was Jack Brownscheitel, who probably would have been the third or fourth best on most teams. He was also voted first-team All-Star and pitched a 25-shot shutout in the mid-season All-Star game. Liut even came second to Gretzky in the closest Hart Trophy race to date. It also just so happened to be a contract year. Blues GM Emile Francis rewarded Liut's breakout with a 5-year contract worth $900,000 annually. While the Blues wildly ascended the standings, attendance saw only a modest uptick. The club had been purchased by R. Hal Dean on behalf of Ralston Purina in July 1977. When Dean retired in 1979, the Blues lost its strongest internal advocate. By the time Liut won his Pearson, Ralston Purina saw the franchise as an albatross. The company was actively seeking an exit to focus on their primary business interests. The suitors were few and far between. By 1982, after taking on an estimated $8 million in losses since acquiring the team, the company was desperate to sell. They tried to sell the Blues to Bill Hunter, who had helped found the WHA. Hunter intended to move the team to Saskatoon. For a time, a deal in principle was reached, with most financing in place, but the league intervened. With the league blocking the sale, Ralston Purina sued the league. The league countersued, and the company took steps to fold the team and sell off the players' contracts. Staff was laid off en masse. Emile Francis resigned and moved to Hartford. The team didn't even participate in the 1983 entry draft. But the league stepped in, assumed control of player contracts, and prevented the franchise from being dissolved. They even found a buyer who was willing to keep the team in St. Louis. Harry Ornest bought the team at pennies on the dollar and immediately started watching the budget. The biggest ticket item in his sights was Mike Liut's contract. Liut saw the writing on the wall. He played the entire 1983-84 season knowing that each game could be his last as a Blue. By season's end, he still wore the Blue note. The off-season passed without incident. Then, the new season began. When Caron acquired goalie Rick Walmsley from the Montreal Canadiens, Liut perceived a deal was imminent. Liut understood that as soon as Caron's asking price was met, he was gone. In an odd turn, the better Liut played, the higher the chances that he would be moved. He likely assumed it would be to a contender, Boston perhaps. Then an old friend called from New England. Emile Francis was the man who had signed Liut to his big contract, and had no problem paying the rest of it out in Hartford. Liut was the exact, veteran, stabilizing force the Whalers needed to take themselves seriously. The Blues were happy. They were still in first place and now had two #1 goalies to work with in Walmsley and Millen. More importantly, they saved money on the deal. Millen's contract was worth a reported $400,000 a year, while Mark Johnson's was worth an estimated $250,000, allowing the team to save $250,000 from Liut's $900,000. Johnson was flipped in the offseason in yet another cost-saving move. With Fedorko, Doug Gilmour, and Rick Mahar on the team, it didn't really make sense to keep him at that price point. Fedorko and Gilmour wound up in the Hall of Fame. Mahar would later win a Selke Trophy with the Blues. Millen and Walmsley developed into a dynamic duo for several seasons. In 1986, the duo helped the team to the conference final on a rotation. Liut led the Whalers to their best seasons, taking the eventual Cup champs, the Montreal Canadiens, to overtime of Game 7 of the division final. It was as far as the Whalers would ever go in the postseason. They even threw a parade for the team. Programmer's note: for more on this story, see our previous video on the subject. The following season, the Whalers would win their only division title in club history, and Liut would finish runner-up for the Vezina. With his time split between St. Louis and Hartford, Liut ended up with the most games, wins, saves, and shutouts for any goalie during the decade of the 1980s. After being forced into early retirement due to an eye injury in 1992, Liut would become a player agent. His experiences during this timeline were seemingly formative, giving him a unique perspective on the practicalities of player salaries and a team's fiscal requirements. In December 1986, Harry Ornest sold the Blues to local businessman Mike Shanahan. In the 3.5 years Ornest owned the team, he cut the Blues' $4.5 million payroll by $1 million, raised ticket prices by 10%, bringing down the break-even mark for ticket sales. He also increased the club's TV presence, filled the venue with more events, and built luxury suites. All of these moves increased profitability. It came with a flip side. Ornest developed a reputation as a cheapskate owner, arguably the worst offender in that regard. When the Blues lost Game 7 of the conference final, he canceled the charter flight home. Rumors circulated that the move was punitive, but it was almost certainly an airline error. Such was the state of his penny-pinching reputation. When he sold the team, he made a large profit. This happened not long before the NFL Cardinals left the city for Phoenix. The Shanahan Group stabilized the Blues, and attendance climbed steadily with the emergence of superstar Brett Hull and the opening of the Kiel Center in 1994. Eventually, the club became one of the hottest tickets in the league, and has essentially remained so ever since, with only minor hiccups.
During the 1930s, Boston Bruins defenseman Eddie Shore dominated the NHL. He won 4 Hart trophies during the decade, and had there been an award for top defender, he would have been a perennial finalist. By the time the Norris Trophy was first awarded, Shore was already enshrined in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was a punishing defender who laid crushing hits and wasn't afraid to lay the lumber, but he was also a fearless offensive attacker who would pinch down and rush the net, an almost unheard-of attribute for a defenseman at the time. That freedom depended on a partner who knew how to cover for him. That partner was Lionel Hitchman. He may have learned how to cover so well because before joining the NHL, he was an active-duty, badge-wielding member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He was considered the best defensive defenseman of his era. He was a gifted athlete who excelled at every sport he tried, but hockey became his focus as a member of his neighborhood club, Witchwood, which won Toronto City Championships from 1917 to 1919. His next stop was the legendary Toronto Ora Lee Junior Club, where he played a limited role but dressed alongside several future greats. After moving to Ottawa, he played amateur hockey with the Ottawa New Edinburghs, while serving as a 20-year-old rookie with the RCMP. He also played on RCMP's Civil Service League teams, where he came to the attention of the Ottawa Senators. By that point, he had already mastered the sweep check and the poke check, creating turnovers and reversing the direction of play. He was also widely admired for his crushing yet clean body checks. By then, he had moved from the RCMP to the Ontario Provincial Police. In one apocryphal story, he walked unarmed into a bootlegging operation and broke it up with his bare hands. When the Ottawa Senators offered him a contract and he was forced to choose between careers, he chose hockey. If Hitchman had hoped to avoid extreme violence, choosing hockey over police work proved no refuge. In just his second NHL game, he encountered Sprague Cleghorn, arguably the meanest, dirtiest player of all time. Late in a 1-0 game in Montreal's favor, Hitchman chirped that Cleghorn couldn't hurt a fly. Moments later, while carrying the puck up ice in the dying moments, Hitchman was struck on the side of the head by a vicious cross-check to the temple. It was Cleghorn. Hitchman rose smiling and bleeding, then collapsed and had to be helped from the ice. From that point on, Cleghorn made a point of paying extra attention to Hitchman whenever they met. They met again in the Stanley Cup Final. In Game 1, Cleghorn cross-checked Hitchman in the face, breaking his nose and dislodging several teeth. Hitchman finished the game with his face patched together while Cleghorn was ejected for the play. The hit was severe enough that Cleghorn was fined $200 and suspended for the following game by his own manager, Leo Dandurand. The Senators went on to win the game and the series. When Hitchman signed with the Ottawa Senators, they were already a professional hockey superpower. They had won 2 of the previous 3 Stanley Cups with their Super Six lineup, falling short only the season before. This was an era when star players rarely left the ice, aside from brief rests or time in the penalty box. The 1923 Senators dressed just 10 players for the entire season. 8 of them would eventually be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Hitchman was one of the 2 who were not. Hitchman signed with only a few games remaining in the regular season, but appeared in the playoffs in time to take part in Ottawa's 3rd Stanley Cup victory in 4 years. By the end of the final, he had played just 5 professional games and already had his name engraved on the Stanley Cup. This was the NHL's original dynasty. Aside from the occasional cross-check to the head or butt end to the face, life was good as an Ottawa Senator. The problem was opportunity. With a defense core that already included Captain Eddie Gorman, George Boucher, and a young King Clancy, there was limited ice time to go around. Even so, Hitchman managed to share the league lead in assists during the 1924 season with 10, a significant total in an era when the forward pass was still illegal. By the following season, Hitchman had grown frustrated with his limited role on a crowded Ottawa blue line and requested a transfer to the new expansion Boston Bruins, where he expected to see more ice time. The Senators, unwilling to lose a valuable asset for nothing, but wanting to accommodate the request, agreed to loan him to Boston for the remainder of the season. There was one problem. Bruins owner Charles Adams refused to accept him. As with many ownership decisions in Bruins history, the issue came down to pride. Adams had no interest in accepting a player on loan or out of charity. He was, however, willing to acquire Hitchman outright, agreeing to purchase his contract from Ottawa, a transaction that would be illegal under today's NHL rules. Hitchman made an immediate impact in Boston. The Bruins had won their first game as a franchise, and then lost their next 11. With Hitchman in the lineup, they won his debut and finished the season on a 5-13 run. Hardly remarkable, but a clear improvement over their opening stretch. Hitchman was the club's best player that year and its first true star, even if the nature of his game limited formal recognition. He played a smart, steady, unflashy style that would define his career. Bruins coach and manager Art Ross later referred to him as the cornerstone of the franchise. Before the following season, Ross acquired Sprague Cleghorn from the Montreal Canadiens. Cleghorn was 2 years removed from a runner-up finish for the Hart Trophy and, at 35, was named the Bruins' first team captain. Paired with Hitchman, the two formed a tough, reliable defensive duo. By then, Hitchman had already mastered the technical aspects of defense, stick work and positioning chief among them. But Cleghorn took him under his wing and introduced him to the less refined elements of the position. Under Cleghorn's influence, Hitchman developed a reputation as one of the league's scrappiest defenders and hardest hitters. That season, the Bruins found their identity, closing the schedule on a 13-3-1 run, but falling just short of a playoff berth. For his role in stabilizing the club, Cleghorn finished as the runner-up in Hart Trophy voting. That offseason, Ross made a pair of moves that would solidify the Bruins' identity. With the collapse of the Western Canadian Hockey League, Boston acquired Eddie Shore from the Edmonton Eskimos. They also added Billy Cucci from Montreal. Along with Hitchman and Cleghorn, the Bruins now iced one of the toughest defensive quartets the league had ever seen. Hitchman was paired with Shore, an ideal balance of a rushing defenseman alongside a stay-at-home presence. The arrangement carried Boston to the Stanley Cup final against Ottawa. The series was hard-fought, and the deciding game descended into chaos. Unhappy with the officiating, Ross ordered his players to provoke a melee and ensure the referee was caught in the middle. During the confusion, Billy Cucci assaulted referee Jerry Laflamme while feigning an attack on an opponent. The brawl escalated to the point that Ottawa police stepped onto the ice to assist officials. Hitchman and teammate Jimmy Herbert were ejected, along with Ottawa's Hooley Smith and George Boucher. Cucci received a lifetime ban for his actions. Though the ban was later lifted, his playing career was effectively over. When Cleghorn retired, Ross selected Hitchman to replace him as team captain. It was an obvious move. Contemporary newspaper accounts had already referred to Hitchman as vice captain while Cleghorn was still with the club, a term unheard of today. The decision paid off, with another trip to the Stanley Cup final and a victory over the defending champion New York Rangers. The following season, Hitchman captained the Bruins to the best record in league history, finishing 38-5-1, an .875 winning percentage, equivalent to a 70-win pace over an 82-game schedule. Late in the year, he took a clearing pass to the jaw, fracturing it. He finished the game without painkillers but missed the remainder of the regular season. He returned 2 weeks later for the playoffs wearing a leather helmet designed by Art Ross, complete with a thick chin strap to protect the injury. He was among the first players to wear such equipment. Boston reached the Stanley Cup final but lost to Montreal in 2 games. The first time all season the Bruins had dropped consecutive contests. Hitchman finished second in Hart Trophy voting. Some contemporaries later said that Hitchman was never quite the same after the jaw injury. In recent years, his granddaughter, Pam Coburn, addressed this period in her biography, Hitch, describing the cumulative impact of repeated concussions on his career and post-career life. The jaw injury may have marked the point at which the effects of those injuries began to take hold. Hitchman continued to anchor the Bruins' blue line for several more seasons, retiring before the end of the 1934 campaign. His final game was a 3-1 overtime loss. That's right, a 2-goal loss in overtime. Those were different times. Shortly afterward, the Bruins retired his number 3. It was the second jersey retirement in North American professional sports. Earlier that same week, the Toronto Maple Leafs had retired Ace Bailey's number 6 after Hitchman's long-term partner, Eddie Shore, ended Bailey's career on the ice, an incident that nearly killed him. Hitchman's final game came during Shore's first appearance back from a lengthy suspension stemming from that play. Hitchman finished his career having played 360 games with the Bruins, missing only 22 despite suffering a broken jaw, a separated shoulder, and multiple concussions. He scored 25 goals and 52 points while accumulating 511 penalty minutes. Those numbers only tell part of the story. Among his contemporaries, Hitchman was consistently described as the best checker, the hardest hitter, the most difficult to get around, the smartest defender, the greatest shot blocker, and the greatest defensive defenseman, lauded for his heart and more. Hitchman died nearly 60 years ago and has never been inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, despite being regarded by some as one of the most deserving eligible players. Defensive defensemen have never been formally recognized by the NHL. The Norris Trophy, awarded annually to the league's top defensemen, has traditionally favored offensive production, with only occasional exceptions. There has never been a separate award dedicated specifically to defensive defensemen. When Hall of Fame cases are later considered, formal honors and distinctions tend to carry weight, and players whose value was primarily defensive are often left with little institutional record of their impact.
In the late 1920s, Eddie Shore was the biggest attraction in hockey. Before every home game in Boston, he had his own entrance, fanfare, a cape, and a spotlight. The crowd loved it. Opponents didn't. And one night, one of them decided to do something about it. Charlie McVeigh entered the NHL at age 28. He was a small, speedy winger who was at one time called the best in the West while he played in the old Major Pro West Coast League during the 1920s. They called him Rabbit for his practice of jumping over defenders' sticks while leading the rush. He played fearlessly, dashing down the ice at full speed, swerving and leaping over sticks, never losing track of the puck. In 1924-25, he was teammates with rookie defenseman Eddie Shore on the Regina Capitals. The Capitals finished with the worst record in the circuit and folded after the season. By 1928, he wound up with the New York Americans, where he remained a leader for 7 productive seasons. McVeigh had spent 3 years overseas fighting World War I. He went over the top at Vimy Ridge. The fighting had a profound effect on him and shaped his character. He spent months in hospital with a stomach wound and, while in there, caught a bad case of the flu. He said, "My body became a punching bag for doctors' needles. Every inch of me became an inoculation. I came out of it pretty deaf." After his playing career ended, McVeigh became an official. During one on-ice incident, Red Wings defender Ebby Goodfellow argued a call and came after him. "Listen," McVeigh told him, "in the last war I got $1.10 a day for killing big tramps like you." Shore ended up in Boston and was marketed as a star by Art Ross, even before he'd proven himself. In the early going, Bruins defensive pair Lionel Hitchman and Sprague Cleghorn would stay out for most of the game. Ross would play Shore as a forward just to give him ice time. Shore embraced the extra attention and played it up, marking himself as a fearless puck-rushing attacker and one of the toughest customers in the league. He also had a flair for showmanship. Before the start of each home game, Shore and Ross worked out a routine where the Bruins would be out during warm-ups, when suddenly the band would strike up "Hail to the Chief." Shore would emerge ceremoniously from the bowels of the Boston arena wearing a black toreador cape, followed by a manservant. Shore would do a couple laps around the ice surface, then stop and allow his manservant to remove the cape from his shoulders. The crowd ate up the spectacle gleefully. Visiting opponents, however, found it unbearable. One night, the Americans rolled into town. The Americans' attack had been surprisingly effective against the Bruins, even in Boston. During warm-ups, Shore skated out for his regular routine. After Shore's manservant removed the cape from his shoulders, another fanfare blared, this time from the visitors' bench. 2 men rolled a red carpet onto the ice.
A 5'6" figure decked out in stars and stripes tripped along the carpet, blowing kisses and waving to the disbelieving crowd. It was Rabbit McVeigh. After that, Shore gave up on the routine.
Stop me if you've heard this one before. The NHL was facing a crisis. Clutching, grabbing, hooking, and obstruction had slowed the game to a grinding halt, rendering it virtually unwatchable to casual fans. Then, in its darkest hour, league officials stepped in to crack down on rough play to go along with significant rule changes in an effort to open up the game and make it accessible again. The year is 1930. It's the height of the Great Depression, and it's up to an on-ice official to save the game. At the time, the NHL was not yet the institution that it is today. This was near the beginning of what hockey historians refer to as the establishment years. The league was less than 15 years old. Possession of the Stanley Cup trophy could still be challenged by outsiders. Waning interest in the sport had recently caused the collapse of two different major hockey leagues on the West Coast. This helped open up the NHL into America, but America had its own problems at the time. Economic instability was being felt in every sector of society, and hockey was not exempt from its effects. The survival of the NHL was not assured. Essentially, every entertainment dollar was hard-earned in a society where money and work were scarce. Hockey's rules didn't allow for forward passes in the attacking zone. This allowed for a trap-style defensive system where defenders would stand attackers up at the blue line by obstruction, holding, and merciless cross-checking. Eventually, an offensive player would break through to create a rush play that would usually result in a save and a whistle. In short, NHL games were boring and low-event affairs. The season before, Montreal Canadiens goalie George Hainsworth had 22 shutouts in 44 games, and 6 of those ended in ties. For the 1929-30 season, the NHL instituted a new rule that would make the game more exciting. It would allow the forward pass in all 3 zones. This innovation changed the style of play from a stick-handling game to a passing game. This meant that teams had to now play as a unit instead of as a collection of solo puck carriers. The immediate results were readily apparent. The average NHL game featured 3 more goals than the previous season. But this is only one part of the story. As seen in later decades, the forward pass doesn't guarantee it will defeat a trap-style system. That would require rule enforcement meant to speed up play and free up offense. The way Eddie Shore tells it, there was one man brave enough to dictate play and forcibly change the tactics of the average defender, and he wasn't a coach. Holding court in an all-night Montreal diner, Eddie Shore told the forgotten story of the crackdown that saved the game. In 1953, Shore was owner, coach, and general manager of the Springfield Indians. He was there at the Chicken Coop for a meeting with Quebec League officials. There, he lamented the state of the game, waxing poetic about the beauty of his beloved sport, the speed and skill which was snuffed out by the violent efforts of barbarian defenders. His thesis was simple: eliminate hooking, holding, and cross-checking from the game, and the game itself would become more exciting again. One of his listeners objected, wondering how such a thing could actually be pulled off. Shore then gave the group a history lesson. Frank Calder, who was NHL president at the time, enlisted veteran referee Mickey Ion to do just that: eliminate obstruction and call the game by the book. Ion called everything. Shore was involved in one contest where 24 minor penalties were called, including 6 on Shore himself. Everybody thought Ion was crazy. The number of goals increased. The way Shore has it, the people started flocking back into the buildings. His listeners leaned in. On the ice, Ion was the right man to perform triage. The rules against obstruction already existed, but Shore credits Ion with the will to enforce them. The man-advantage heavy play allowed a real-time pressure test for the new pass-first offensive systems to establish and thrive. Scoring chances increased. Game flow improved tremendously. Whenever he had to train a new referee, Ion would have them remember a simple saying: "From now until the end of the game, you and I are the only sane men in the building." Ion would call so many penalties in that era that opposing players would have to share the penalty box, crowding as many as 7 together at a time. In one incident, a bench-clearing brawl between the Maple Leafs and New York Americans delayed gameplay by 15 minutes and required police assistance to break up. Ion's solution was to call the 2 opposing players who started it for 20-minute penalties each, ensuring the period could end without further retaliation. Sometimes he'd even call phantom penalties just to assert his authority. When Toe Blake was a young player for the Maroons, Ion called him for a minor penalty. As he was skating to the penalty box, Blake told Ion he couldn't say what was on his mind because he'd raised the penalty. Ion's hand immediately went back up, as he changed the penalty to a major. "Nobody's going to think obscenities like that about me," Ion said. Shore waved his hand dismissively. "Yeah, but in a couple years, the game slipped back into the old groove," he said. Clutching and grabbing once again dictated play. Referees quietly slipped back into game management. But by then, the danger had passed. Fans had returned. The buildings were fuller. Hockey had proven it could still command scarce entertainment dollars in a world where money, jobs, and even leagues themselves were disappearing. Not every club survived that era. Teams failed in Ottawa, New York, Montreal, and elsewhere, but the NHL did. And once survival was assured, urgency gave way to comfort. Mickey Ion didn't change hockey forever. He didn't invent new rules, and he didn't redesign the sport. What he did was prove something: that the game could move faster, that skill could breathe, that passing could replace individual rushes, and that fans would respond when the ice opened up. His enforcement created a brief but decisive pressure test, one that showed what hockey could be when the rule book was treated as law instead of suggestion. When that proof was no longer needed, Ion faded back into the machinery. Eventually, he gained a reputation as a referee who let too much go. The same man who once called everything was now blamed for calling too little. But the important work had already been done. Hockey had crossed a threshold. It had survived its most fragile years and earned its place in the entertainment economy. The modern game, faster, more interconnected, built on movement rather than attrition, traces part of its lineage back to a moment when the outcome was not guaranteed. That's the part worth remembering. Not that the NHL survived, but that it very nearly didn't. And that, for a time, one official was willing to stand alone on the ice and insist that the game live up to what it promised to be.
The sign hung across the front of the medieval castle-like Chicago Coliseum. It said, "Rink closed, no game," in big black letters. The St. Paul Saints were stunned. They'd come a long way to play a game that was canceled. For most of the Chicago Cardinals, this season represented their first professional experience. Now, it had seemingly been cut off midstream. Defenseman Marvin Wentworth was one of them. He'd been plucked from Windsor, Ontario in the seniors men's circuit and finished third in club scoring with the Cardinals. The Cardinals played out of the newly formed American Hockey Association, a minor pro league intended to be a major rival to the National League. The Cardinals' owner was Eddie Livingstone, who had evoked such vitriol from other club owners that they decided to fold the original NHA and form the NHL in its place, just to stick it to him. Wentworth had found out that Livingstone wasn't a bad guy, he just didn't like to be told what to do, or how to think. Livingstone had even given him a colorful nickname,
Cyclone, which would be shortened to Cy. The name was both a blessing and a curse. While on the one hand, it did spotlight Wentworth's contributions, on the other hand, it created unrealistic expectations for a style of play he did not possess. And anyway, a fat load of good it did him now that he was locked out from his own home rink. At this point, he had no choice but to go across town to the Cardinals' rivals, the newly formed Blackhawks, for a place to play. Less than 2 years later, Wentworth once again found himself standing on Wabash, locked out again. Major McLaughlin had a deal in place for the Blackhawks to play their home games at the new Chicago Stadium on Madison Avenue. The problem was that construction wasn't finished on time, and McLaughlin could only secure ice time at the Coliseum through January of 1929. For the rest of the 1928-29 season, the Blackhawks were homeless. The team was forced to play the remainder of its home games on the road. 5 were played at Peace Bridge Arena in Fort Erie, Ontario, 3 at Detroit's Olympia Stadium, and 1 in Windsor, Ontario. Maybe it was the circumstances. Maybe it was because the forward pass was still illegal. Or maybe it was simply that the Blackhawks weren't very good, but they couldn't score. And I mean that literally. For 603 consecutive minutes, spanning 10 NHL games, the Blackhawks failed to score a single goal. The drought finally ended in Windsor when Vic Ripley slid a puck past Clint Benedict's outstretched leg. Wentworth added another in the third period for a 2-1 win. Wentworth finished the season with 2 goals and 1 assist, leading all Blackhawks defensemen in scoring. Chicago was blanked 20 times in a 44-game schedule. In October of 1931, McLaughlin hired a man he'd met on a train named Godfrey Matheson to coach the Hawks. His tenure would prove to be as bizarre as it was brief. Matheson ran practice in a full 3-piece suit, complete with regular street shoes, wearing knee pads and elbow pads over his clothes. He instituted a system of whistles that he expected his players to follow. 1 whistle meant pass, 2 meant shoot, and 3 signaled a change in defensive formation. One thing he did get right was naming Wentworth captain. Even after Matheson left the team for health reasons, some sources claim it was a nervous breakdown, the move stuck. Wentworth had distinguished himself the previous spring in the Stanley Cup Final, elevating his game and scoring the overtime goal in Game 3 that put the Hawks ahead in the series. Chicago would eventually lose in 5. By that point, Wentworth had established himself as one of the best two-way defensemen the league had yet seen. He led Hawks defensemen in scoring in all but one of his 4 seasons, and would do so again in 1932 as captain. He had also developed a reputation for stalwart defensive work. A cerebral, puck-attacking defender, Wentworth used his poke-check technique to strip the puck from attackers, then quickly reverse direction and lead the Chicago attack on the breakaway. He formed a natural brains and brawn pairing with cement block defenseman Taffy Abel, a tandem that was both respected and feared around the league. After the season, Wentworth was sold to the Montreal Maroons for $10,000. This at the height of the Great Depression. He was the 3rd straight Hawks captain to be traded in a span of 3 years. Goaltender Charlie Gardner was named captain next. He led the Hawks to their first Stanley Cup title in 1934, then died in the offseason. After that, nobody wanted the captaincy for a while. With the Maroons, Wentworth didn't have to be the guy. He was simply an important part of a strong group. But in 1935, he came alive. By then, scoring had come down again, though not as dramatically as it had in 1929. Wentworth was now considered to be among, if not the best defensive defenseman in the league. He also led the Maroons' blue line in scoring without dramatic swings in his production. In the playoffs, the game moved on his stick. The Maroons bowled over the Hawks and Rangers before meeting the Maple Leafs in the final series. Wentworth shut down the Leafs' top-rated offense and led his club in scoring with 4 points in 3 games during the final. If the Conn Smythe Trophy had existed then, he would have won it. As it stood, he beat the actual Conn Smythe himself. The Maroons had won their second Stanley Cup. Unfortunately, very few actually cared. Records are sparse, but contemporary accounts suggest attendance at the Montreal Forum for Maroons home games had fallen from 8,000 or 9,000 before the Depression to fewer than 6,000 by 1935, and the trend was deepening. 4,000 souls attended the 1935 home opener. Wentworth himself almost didn't. For his work on the Maroons' blue line, Tommy Gorman paid Wentworth $5,500 a season. After his playoff performance, Wentworth felt he had a strong case for more. He'd also been named to the NHL All-Star team as one of the league's premier defensemen. He wired Gorman asking for an additional $500 for the upcoming year. There was no reply. Training camp opened in Winnipeg. Wentworth stayed home in Hamilton. Gorman urged Wentworth to report to camp, promising they would discuss the money in person. Wentworth didn't budge. Gorman sent the contract by mail. Wentworth boarded the next train. The following season, the Maroons found themselves in a playoff position again. This time, however, they wouldn't cruise through without a loss. They were in a battle. One of the toughest the NHL has ever seen. It took 176 minutes for Detroit's Mud Brunetto to score the first goal of the series in what was the longest game ever played. The Maroons rallied back in Game 2, but after the series shifted to Detroit, the Red Wings took control of it. By doing so, they'd cost Wentworth $500 in playoff bonus money, making his hard-fought contract refinancing a bit of a wash. During his playing days and after, Wentworth was asked more than once to name favorite players or select all-star teams. He never chose himself or his teammates, always deflecting credit to others. It may sound like a slight, but it wasn't meant to be. It was simply a reflection of Wentworth's humility, refracted through a leadership lens. Even the name he's known by in the record books reflects that humility. A nickname that began as Cyclone, foisted on him by a shameless promoter, was eventually shortened by Wentworth himself to Cy. Arguably, this allergy to self-promotion may be part of the reason why he's not a member of the Hall of Fame, and why his career is largely forgotten today. In 2016, the Grimsby Lincoln News ran a short article about an older man, a local hockey history enthusiast, who asked everyone he could in Grimsby, Ontario, Wentworth's hometown, whether they knew who he was or that he had been the key contributor to the 1935 Stanley Cup. Nobody remembered.
The Bill Masterton Memorial Trophy is awarded annually to the NHL player who best exemplifies the qualities of perseverance, sportsmanship, and dedication to hockey. It is most often associated with comeback seasons, players who return from injury, illness, or personal hardship to continue competing at the highest level. The trophy is named after Bill Masterton, whose tragic on-ice death remains, thankfully, the only fatal incident in NHL history. There have been close calls since, and tragedies in other leagues, which are worthy of their own examination. Naming a memorial trophy after a recently deceased player made sense to the NHL of the 1960s. What is less obvious is why Masterton's name became associated with perseverance and dedication, given that he appeared in just 38 NHL games over a single season. Bill Masterton, or Bat as his teammates called him, after the Old West hero of the same name, took an unusual path to the NHL, to say the least. The Winnipeg native, who, at 6 foot, 190 pounds, had pretty good NHL size for the time, decided to go the university route after finishing a promising junior career with the St. Boniface Canadiens in 1956-57 and signed with the University of Denver. There, he put up 3 terrific seasons, improving each year from 49 to 67 to 80 points, finishing his senior year in 1960-61 with a team record of 30-1-1 in the standings, and was a two-time NCAA West First Division Team All-Star, a national champion, and championship tournament MVP. He also finished his collegiate career as the school's all-time leading scorer, a record which stood for 25 years when it was smashed by Dallas Gourmet. With his college career in the rearview mirror, he set his sights on turning pro, targeting the biggest powerhouse in the sport's only major league. He signed with the Montreal Canadiens organization, a move that must have seemed terribly exciting considering they had just won 5 of the previous 6 Stanley Cups, but in hindsight appears somewhat short-sighted. When he signed, the Montreal Gazette hailed Masterton as the leader and captain of the greatest college hockey team ever assembled. In his 2 seasons in the Canadiens' farm system, Masterton enjoyed decent success, winning a championship his first season with Hull Ottawa, Montreal's secondary farm club in the old Eastern Professional League, and then graduated to their AHL squad, the Cleveland Barons, in 1962-63. There he had a very strong showing, finishing 2nd in team scoring and 6th in league scoring with 82 points, playing alongside the likes of future NHL mainstays John Ferguson, Gary Bergman, and Les Binkley. He also finished runner-up for the Dudley Red Garrett Memorial Award for Rookie of the Year to Doug Robinson of the Buffalo Bisons, though he outscored Robinson by 6 points. The problem was, the parent club proved difficult to crack, considering their center depth chart consisted of the likes of Hall of Famers Jean Beliveau and Henri Richard, to go along with Ralph Backstrom, Don Marshall, and Phil Goyette, all of whom would take turns as stars in the NHL at one point or other. In Backstrom's case, that point was then current, and keep in mind that at the time, an NHL roster consisted of only 3 lines of forwards, with a spare or 2, instead of the 4 lines worth of forwards employed today. For most, 2 years of trying to crack the best team in the world wouldn't be enough to discourage them from their dream of playing in the NHL. But Masterton had his sights set on other goals. When the league's interleague draft came and went without any of the other 5 NHL clubs willing to take on his contract, Masterton decided to quit hockey, returning to Denver and finishing his master's degree in 1964. The move hurt the Cleveland Barons. His loss was the team's biggest of the offseason, and was made even worse because it was unexpected. By then he was married, and was offered a contract to work for Honeywell, setting up a home for his growing family in Minnesota. He took it, and for a little while anyway, hockey took a back seat. But it didn't take long before the game called him back. In the 1964-65 season, he resumed his playing career, albeit at the amateur level, with the Rochester Mustangs of the Minnesota-based U.S. Hockey League. The following season, he wore the sweater of the St. Paul Steers, who played in the same league, racking up 67 points in a mere 30 games and leading the circuit with 40 helpers. The following year, Masterton played for the U.S. national team after hours from his Honeywell job, alongside the likes of Carl Wetzel, John Cuniff, and Team USA legend Herb Brooks. There he put up 39 points, including a league-best 29 helpers in just 21 contests. Though he wasn't American by birth, he had become a naturalized citizen and captained the national squad and was its MVP. It's there that he attracted the attention of the nascent Minnesota North Stars general manager, Ren Blair, a circumstance that, looking back, holds ominous connotations. After speaking with Masterton and getting his blessing, Blair purchased the center iceman's long-dormant contract from the Habs, with the promise of more available roster spots, considering the league was doubling in size from 6 teams to 12. Interestingly, because they had set up a home there, Masterton wouldn't have agreed to play anywhere other than Minnesota. He went into training camp in 1967, expecting to play the whole year with Minnesota's farm team, the Memphis South Stars. But a stint coaching in a summer league kept him sharp, and, after suffering and then rehabbing a separated shoulder during camp, He broke camp as the number 4 center for the Minnesota North Stars on opening night, behind Andre Boudria, Ray Cullen, and Murray Hall. The other player Masterton was vying for ice time against was Len Lundy. A weird note here is that all 4 of these other guys would go on to play for the Vancouver Canucks when they became an NHL expansion team. Based on Masterton's profile, it seems unlikely that he would have followed suit, but it is reasonable to speculate that he might have pursued a career in coaching after his playing days were finished. Then came the biggest night of Masterton's professional hockey career, the moment he went from amateur to NHLer. Opening night, October 11th, 1967. It was a little past the midway mark of the second period in a scoreless draw against Scotty Bowman's St. Louis Blues, who were also skating in their first ever NHL contest. St. Louis Blues defenseman Fred Stoneface Huckle took a boarding penalty to put Minnesota on their 4th power play of the night. During this man advantage, Bill Masterton scored an unassisted goal on the backhand from close in at the 15-20 mark to take the lead and cement his place in history with the first tally in franchise history. The game would ultimately end in a 2-2 draw. By the end of the first half of the North Stars' inaugural schedule, the team was only a game under .500, a winning percentage that was a pleasant surprise, and one that manager/coach Blair credited, at least partially, to Masterton's play. After 37 games, he had amassed 4 goals and 8 assists, not world-beating numbers, but a modest success, and one that could be built on. In fact, he had just put up a career-high 3 helpers and a 6-3 drubbing of the Philadelphia Flyers in his most recent game. He wasn't the fastest skater, and he would never win a hardest shot competition, but he had a relentless motor. Everything he did on the ice was at 100%. He was a worker, the kind of fourth-line center whose contributions rarely appeared in the box score, but were felt palpably on the bench. Part of the reason his scoring numbers were suppressed early on was the inability of wingers Ted Taylor and Bill Goldsworthy to capitalize on his slick setups. Though he would go on to enjoy stardom for the North Stars and Rangers, Goldsworthy would go 5 weeks without a goal while playing with Masterton in limited ice time, and Taylor was ultimately dealt away the day after Christmas. Ted Taylor would also end up with the expansion Vancouver Canucks 3 years later. After the Taylor trade, Masterton was moved from the 4th to the 1st line, centering wingers Dave Ballin and Wayne Connolly. There, chemistry was established and his box score total saw an uptick, scoring a goal and 4 assists in his last 4 games heading into the January 13th contest against Oakland that would usher in the season's second half. Masterton, and indeed the entire world, could never have known going into that game that he wouldn't see the end of it. On a routine play less than 5 minutes into the first period, Masterton, skating up ice with the puck and a full head of steam, was checked by 2 Oakland defenders. Ron Harris was the first to hit him, and sent him careening backwards into Harris's defense partner Larry Cahan. He was flipped backwards end over end. Ren Blair speculated he was probably already unconscious while in the air, and crashed heavily, the back of his head slamming into the ice. After the hit, the 2 Oakland Seals defenders skated right on after the puck, unaware of what had just taken place, but it happened in full view of the North Stars bench. No one who witnessed the play, including referee Wally Harris, considered the hit to be illegal or dirty. Ron Harris, the Oakland Seals player who made the play, was haunted by the event, feeling responsible for Masterton's death, even though it was a routine play and he had no malicious intent. Masterton was carried off the ice on a stretcher. A respirator kept his body alive, but he never regained consciousness, and he was taken off life support after 30 hours, passing into eternity at the age of 29. A helmet would almost certainly have saved his life, but such protective gear was considered unmanly in the NHL at the time. And anyway, most players at any level didn't wear protective helmets, even goalies, though it seems absolutely unfathomable today. Another thing to consider, and something that is rarely, if ever, brought up regarding the incident, is that 2 weeks prior, in a game against Boston, Masterton was checked heavily and subsequently complained of dizziness to his teammates, but never reported it to management. With this revelation, it seems credible that Masterton had been suffering from undiagnosed concussion symptoms, and when he was hit by Harris on an otherwise routine play, it may have been just enough of a jar to knock him unconscious and send his body sprawling like a ragdoll to meet his inevitable grim fate. However, the autopsy revealed no obvious sign of previous trauma or injury. Of course, it's useful to keep in mind that this was 1967, and CTE would go unknown in hockey for another 40 years hence. In the immediate aftermath, the North Stars would lose the next 4 games, a circumstance most would consider reasonable given the circumstances. But Coach Blair attributed the piling losses directly to the loss of Masterton's on-ice abilities, a good tribute from an otherwise peppery personality. And as often happens in these types of cases, it appears Blair found a way to use the tragedy as a kind of rallying cause, as the team course-corrected after their 4-game skid, winning 8 of the next 10 to keep their playoff positions secure. More importantly, however, many players, notably Chicago's Pierre Pilote and their entire scooter line of Stan Mikita, Kenny Warham, and Doug Moens, donned helmets for the first time, prompting some reporters to rebrand them the Headline, as did Toronto's Brian Conacher and Detroit's Howie Young in the aftermath. It has subsequently become mandatory that all players wear a helmet, and though it wasn't that long ago that we saw players play bucket list by choice, a play can now be called dead if a player loses his helmet during game action. Masterton had it all. A good job with a good salary. He was working on the Apollo program for Honeywell. He had a loving wife and 2 adopted children, but he had always wondered what if. What if he had been given a chance to play in the NHL? Would he have made it? Would his talents have stacked up against the best? It was his dream to play in the NHL, and he accomplished that dream, against all odds and against all circumstances. He had retired from professional hockey some 4 years before he suited up for his first NHL game, but he remained dedicated to hockey, showing great perseverance and sportsmanship along the way. Masterton was memorialized with 2 year-end awards. The first was a North Stars Team Award for season MVP, the first recipient of which was starting goalie Cesar Maniago. The second was the aforementioned league-wide award, donated to the NHL by the Professional Hockey Writers Association, and was originally meant to honor the league's unsung hero, who that summer was considered to be Canadiens winger Claude Provost, who was also given all the tough checking and defensive assignments while still maintaining a high standard for scoring. Because the initial Masterton Trophy was meant to sing the praises of the unsung, or unrewarded, and they gave the award to Provost, one might, with a little logical stretch, consider Provost to be the true first Selke Award winner. But anyway, after a few seasons, the award was given its present lasting parameters and definition. After hearing his story, one can appreciate how fitting the award is to the man whose name was given to it.